So now on to Daniel and Tony. Just one quick fact about Tony that you should know about is that he's an ardent Liverpool Football Club supporter. and
you may have just lost most of the audience, David.
Yeah,
if they're not, that's the only problem with that intro.
Yeah, and Daniel has a book out that I don't think all of us knew about, which is called Everything in Moderation, and it's a collection of his greatest columns in the Times. And I just want to say that Wendy Cope, the poet, in her review said, "I think I'm in love with him. I've never met him, but I think I'm in love with him." So just so leaving you with those two little pieces of sort of minutiae, I will hand over to you, Daniel, and look forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, David, and welcome to you all. Nice to see you all again. Tony, when I was just stopped being a student and my sister was still a student, one of her friends applied for his first job in the Sunday Times, and he got the code wrong and applied. He got a letter back saying, "Thank you for your application to be Director General of the CBI." And now, in fact, this particular individual owns Mountain Warehouse, and you are, in other words, somebody that I know, are Director General of the CBI. So this is all a sign that we're all getting older and more mature, but it's also quite a career achievement. And I want to, you've had an extraordinary career. Rather than just introduce you, I want to talk about a couple of highlights in that career. I guess we'll start with the one that that David mentioned, which was that you spent quite a long time on the commercial side of The Guardian. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, by the way, I'm glad that you call it an extraordinary career. I once went for an interview not too long ago, and the person interviewing me, who is a well-known figure in British life, looked at my CV and said, "You have a very eclectic CV," was what they said, in a very British insult way. So eclectic was not a good thing, just so you're all clear. Yeah, so I, after working in government, I ended up at The Guardian on the commercial side of the business. And this was peak challenge for newspaper time. I actually think newspapers are doing pretty well today, Danny. I mean, you can tell us otherwise. That sort of the decline is sort of steadying and it's finding some new life. But yeah, and the big challenge was, how do you build an online business where it's mostly free? Of course, we now have paid models. And how could The Guardian, which had this huge global audience, I mean, almost comparable with the BBC, you know, pretty much after the New York Times, and whilst I was there, overtook the New York Times in terms of a global digital audience. But how could you turn that into money? Because less and less people were buying newspapers, which of course cost £2 a day. And so that's real money. And as you well know, because you'll know this from your Times experience, journalism was everywhere. Everybody became a journalist in the internet. There was an enormous amount of publishing. There was an enormous amount of news, and it was free everywhere. And here we were at The Guardian producing what we thought was much higher quality news than what most people were producing. But if we charged for it, the great fear was the audience would dwindle. And The Guardian had this sort of mission-driven approach to wanting as many people as possible in the world to read its journalism. So yes, I spent 7 years at The Guardian, and it was, I mean, newspapers are amazingly weird institutions, as you well know. But it was very exciting because we also, the job that I had really was as international director of The Guardian. I opened new Guardians in the US, I opened The Guardian in Australia. And then I was responsible for striking these deals with the global technology giants, the Facebooks and the Googles, all the people who, by the way, now are paying for news following a settlement in Australia that's sort of, you know, pooling around the world. But at the time, they weren't paying for news. So people were getting news for free on all these websites, and we weren't getting any money for it. So that was my gig at The Guardian for 7 years. And it was fabulous. It was an incredible experience.
Well, talking about there being no money left, the other big thing that I know you for is working for Liam Byrne, whom I think both of us agree is a person of great character and intellect. Actually, we've got a lot of respect for him. He's just recently tried running for the mayor of in the West Midlands and lost. But tell us about a little bit about that earlier period. And were you weren't still working for him, I suppose, at the time when with the no money left? I think you'd gone by then, or
no, we'd sort of both gone by then. We both sort of went on the same day because, as you know, as the minute a general election is called, then all the political appointments and ministers down tools, and you walk out of government offices. But no, I'd known Liam very well from university days. I was the head of the Jewish Society, and he was the head of the Labour Society at Manchester University. So we knew each other pretty well. And then, yes, a week after Lehman Brothers, I got a couple of calls, actually. One was from Jeremy Haywood, the late Jeremy Haywood, who I knew, to say, we're reorganizing Downing Street in the Cabinet Office. Liam's coming in to help do X. Can you come in and help? And from Liam to say, come in and help us. And I spent a year in the Cabinet Office and then a year at the Treasury with Alistair Darling and Liam. And it was, I mean, I tell you what's really interesting about that. Some of us may not remember it by now, but 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers was a real crisis, and it's an amazing thing to work in government at a time of a crisis like that. And it is what is happening today, and the people I know and I speak to in government, it is highly reminiscent of what it was like 12 years ago, which is there has never been you've never had a more exhausting period in your life. You've never worked harder in your life. It's never been so fulfilling in your life, and it's never been more important, the work you do. So the work that I did then in the Treasury and the Cabinet Office in Downing Street felt unbelievably important. All of us felt at the time, most of the Labour politicians didn't think Labour would get elected again in 2010, but it almost didn't matter. Just government was incredibly important. And you can see the government now struggling with some of the things we struggled with then, which is that you are so possessed of managing the current crisis that your ability to do things that we'll come on to, like Build Back Better, you talk about them, but you have almost zero capacity to focus on them. And so I have a lot of empathy for people working in government right now managing the COVID crisis, because the financial crisis was an incredible time to work there.
This is a little bit unfair, and the reason I'm putting this is because I want you to feel free to say I really don't want to go there because of your current job. But what reflections has that left you with in regard to the state of the Labour Party today? We've obviously gone through that period where Jeremy Corbyn's been leader of the party. I doubt whether that was quite your flavour of politics, but Keir Starmer maybe is more so. Why do you think Labour's struggling in the way that it is?
Well, look, I'll give you my personal observation. I can give you a CBI point of view about their economic policy, but if you want my personal observation,
yeah, your personal one.
I think the truth is nobody is listening to the opposition right now, and to be honest, it was pretty hard for David Cameron to get a hearing in 2008 in the middle of the financial crisis, right? It probably took him and George Osborne a year to try and get back into the debate. And that was only after things had really settled down and we were in the expenses crisis. And I remember Labour having the same problem after 2010, because you had Cameron and Nick Clegg, and the media could only focus on two parties. And so nobody in the Labour Party could get heard. And so I think that's the big challenge now, which is when we turn on every night to find out matters of life and death and whether or not we can go out of our house, and we listen to only government ministers. I think it's very, very hard for Labour to be heard, even if they had the most fantastic policies and the most exciting vision and the most dynamic, charismatic leader ever seen in politics. You'd struggle to be heard right now. So I don't know that now is the time to judge them, but I think it's pretty hard for any opposition party now to get into our attention. They'd have to do something pretty special, I would think. I mean, you are the expert, Danny, on this more than me in terms of a political commentator. Do you think that I'm being too generous and actually there'd be plenty of a hearing for them if they were doing something different?
No, I don't. I think you're right, but it's not the full answer. Is would be my, I don't want to take the time up when we've got brilliant you to talk to, but I think there's more to it than that. I think they've got a structural problem which they're not sorting out. But we'll put that to one side. So somebody comes to you and they said, Mr. Danker, my son has the ambition of becoming Director General of the CBI, and he'd like some career advice. Right? Tell us how you got the job of being Director General of the CBI. Right?
I put in the wrong code. So do you mean in a deep, profound way, starting from when I was a child, or do you mean a year ago?
I meant really a year ago, but either's fine.
Yeah, well, I'll spare you the deep account. So I went to see John Allen, who was who is still the chairman of Tesco and the chairman of Barratt Homes, and at the time was the president of the CBI. And I was unaware that the CBI were looking for a new Director General. In fact, at the time, I didn't realize that it's a 5-year term. It's a fixed 5-year term. So you only have me for another 4.5 years. And I went to see John. I was working at Be the Business at the time, which was a sort of organization set up by George Osborne and with Charlie Mayfield. And we were trying to get corporates involved in this campaign to tackle UK productivity. And so I was going to John to pitch him. I needed money. I needed mentors. I needed corporate support. And I sat down, and John, who is a very, very elegant man, said, I'd like to talk to you about being Carolyn's successor. And I was utterly flabbergasted and completely unprepared for the conversation. And so he then spent the next hour pitching me. Now, I realize he was pitching other people too, by the way. There was some decency to the process. And it was really interesting because it was sort of just pre-COVID. And over the period of the process, we had the first lockdown. And at the beginning, I wasn't sure, if I'm honest with you. And then as it became clear the magnitude of the crisis facing the country, and as it became clear that that was going to migrate into an economic crisis too, it just became one of those things that was, one of life's great opportunities. And by the time it came to the final interview, I was really excited and desperate for the job. And so, yeah, that's the story, really.
It is, you can't extend it into, why do they have only 5-year periods? Why do they do it like that?
To be honest, I don't really know. I haven't yet read our Royal Charter. We are a Royal Charter organization, and I haven't actually read it. That's a terrible confession. That's a scoop right there, Danny. But I don't know why it's only 5 years, but I think, I don't even know if you could extend it, but I don't think anyone ever has. I think probably talking to Carolyn and Richard Lambert and Digby Jones and Adair, I've spoken to all the oldies. I think they're all exhausted by the end of it. So I'm not sure anybody's queuing up for another 5.
Okay, well, let's talk about the CBI itself. People will have some vague idea that it's the voice of business, but it's a slightly odd organization. It's like sort of it's membership organization. It's part lobbying, part training. Tell us about what the CBI is.
Yeah, well, look, it was founded by Royal Charter in the 60s. It has 3 essentially Royal Charter objectives. One is to shape a conducive business environment in public policy. In other words, and that's where the lobbying stuff comes from, although we like to call it advocacy. So it's to try and shape good government policy so that businesses can flourish and the economy can grow. Secondly, it's to champion business. A lot of what I do is to show the good side of business, counter to some of the narrative about the bad side of business. And thirdly, which is a bit we haven't really done a lot of, but I'd like to do more of, it's to promote effective business success. So that's the sort of objectives. The institution itself, you're right. So first of all, it's a confederation. So what people don't know about the CBI is that we have 190 trade associations who are members of the CBI. So I was on the phone today to the National Farmers Union. I was on the phone the other day to the Society of Motor Manufacturers. And so what we try and be is not that we represent every single business one by one, but that we represent the whole business sector. And so we are non-sector specific, right? So yes, we've got a bunch of, car manufacturers, and we've got some, distillers, and we've got some banks, but we like to be the voice of business and a confederation of all those industries. And I think that's important because it makes us a natural home for those sort of big cross-cutting issues: future of the economy, the relationship between business and society, skills, decarbonizing the economy. We're really good at those things. Whereas if you want to know, what should be the business rates that retailers play, I mean, we'll give you a point of view, but you should go to the British Retail Consortium, who, by the way, are one of our members. And then, yes, final point, we're a membership organization. What that means is it's actually a very high, I mean, it's sort of like a council and committee structure, but it's really quite effective, because I will go, if I spend a week on some of our councils and committees, pretty quickly I'll know what's going on in the retail sector, the telecom sector, what's going on in the Northeast, what's going on in the Northwest. So there's a lot of to and fro communication up and down, so that we are always, you could ask me a question about the economy, I shouldn't tempt you, and I'll have a pretty good point of view from most sectors in the economy at any one time.
Okay, so one of the words that you used will have everyone pricking up their ears, because it's become contentious in politics, and that is lobbying. Yeah. Okay. If you had the let's say Liam was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and you obviously therefore had his text number, would it be reasonable for you to text him?
I think absolutely. I mean, we'd want to talk about what I was texting him with, right? Ergo, we get into the David Cameron discussion. But look, I think my take on lobbying is this, which is lobbying happens every single day, thousands of times a day, right? So government, and thank God, because government utterly relies on dialogue with business to understand what it is they are doing. So whether or not it's, I don't know, so we need to get, we need to get the Kickstart program going, and therefore we want to get lots of young people into new jobs in this downturn with lots of businesses. Now, if they just sat in a room and did that without business interaction, they would get that badly wrong. So you tell me, I text the Chancellor of the Exchequer to say, look, I'm hearing really bad stuff about the Kickstart program. Lots of employers are finding it too complicated. Can we come in and talk to you about it? Or I think you need to change it. Or I think that needs to happen. I think the issues become a little harder when you're talking about preferential access or lack of transparency, or avoiding due process. That's when I think it gets difficult. And then we get into all the recent examples, right? Is Dyson and the Prime Minister, where you look at it and you think, okay, not ideal. At the same time, well done, the Prime Minister. He's trying to get PPE. Cameron and the Chancellor, etc. I think that's harder. I mean, I think there's a big, you might be, again, better than me at this, but I think there's a real question about former prime ministers, whether they can ever do that stuff, or certainly whether 5 years is enough. But I would hate to get rid of the everyday business lobbying and meetings that are happening literally in every local council, in every university, and at senior cabinet level too. They're really important.
Okay, let's move on to some of the issues. And first of all, more broadly, you've taken a stance. It was very striking. You've said we're post-Brexit now. The CBI is going to take on enthusiastically the agenda that the government has in front of it: productivity, levelling up, recovering from COVID, trying to find new markets after Brexit. Are there not some people in the CBI who say Brexit was a disaster, committed against the advice of big business, led by the Prime Minister who led people to believe it wouldn't harm business when it really would? The CBI should be pretty astringent with this Prime Minister, and he said F business, which was actually, aimed pretty much squarely at the CBI. So maybe the CBI should say F him.
That was a gotcha question, Danny. Not really, to be honest. I mean, I think look, this was a clash of civilizations, right? Business and politics. And the thing that I think the politicians missed was, for us, i.e. team business, it's just business. So, do you want Brexit, which will increase, complexity and increase costs and make trade harder? The answer for most was no. Now, if you were a passionate European or a passionate Brexiteer, then you were a bit conflicted as a business, right? Or as a business person, because actually politics trumps business, and actually national identity and sovereignty trumps business. But for most business people, and most of the ones I know are not stringently political, in fact, they are very apolitical, it just seemed like a bad idea for business. And by the way, once the deal came, they were all delighted, because now we have a deal. And now I speak to businesses every week about Brexit, and I have a weekly meeting with Lord Frost about Brexit. And what they want to talk about is not, oh my God, this is a disaster, what a terrible government. They want to talk about the fact that container costs have gone up, that actually the Northern Ireland border is a bit of a problem, that the rules of origin is complex, and could we sort that out so it's a bit easier to trade? And I think that's a bit of the source of the tension, really. It's like, men are from Venus and women are from Mars. I just think politicians never really got that business people were focused on the money, really.
Can I just tell everyone that if you'd like to contribute to this Q&A, you should put questions in the Q&A queue that's there to the bottom of your screen. It's right as you look at it, and I'll try and ask Tony these questions. But let's because you're originally from Northern Ireland, I suppose, do you how serious is the problem now for businesses trying to trade with or trade in Northern Ireland, and how serious a challenge is that also to the relationship of Northern Ireland to the rest of the United Kingdom?
Yeah, so it's definitely true that the main problem area for free movement of goods, so to speak, is still that Northern Ireland border. It's the sort of Scotland to Northern Ireland, England to Northern Ireland. So most of the stuff in the short straits, as they call it, with the rest of continental Europe is getting back to some kind of normal. It's bureaucratic and it's expensive, but it's flowing. Northern Ireland is harder. Now, the big issue really is whether or not GB businesses will take a decision to stop supplying Northern Ireland. When I was a kid growing up in Belfast, there was always a sort of barometer of progress, was whether or not GB businesses would locate in Northern Ireland. If I remember for years as a kid, we all wanted Marks and Spencers to come to Belfast. And if Marks and Spencers came to Belfast, then that meant the country was making progress. So I think the real risk, and why it's so emotional almost, is that a lot of our members who are manufacturers, retailers, supermarkets, will look at Northern Ireland and choose potentially not to serve the market anymore because it's too complicated, too expensive, or too inefficient. Same is true for drugs companies, by the way. Drugs companies at the moment looking at Northern Ireland and saying, this could just be too hard for the size of market that it is. And for obvious reasons, if you believe in the United Kingdom, that's a problem. And therefore, I think, our own view and my own view is that there isn't really an alternative to the protocol and making the protocol work. Because either we get back to, well, you should all be in the single market, but that's over, or you get back to a hard border in Northern Ireland, and that's problematic. The only thing you're left with is this idea of a protocol, which has special treatment, unusual circumstances for trade both ways. It's unpopular at the moment. It's the best of a bad option, and we need to try and fix it and make it smoother.
Now, how confident are you that that can happen?
I'm pretty confident, really, mainly because I think everybody knows it's the best of bad alternatives. And I think what's clearly happening is in everything Brexit related, what's really interesting is I think, we're only 5 months into something that's changed after 50 years. And I think on the British government side and on the European side, we're working this out, right? I mean, the Europeans made a terrible mistake with the vaccine thing right back at the beginning. And then Lord Frost unilaterally declared that we were going to, put things off. And I think at the moment, there's quite a lot of politics in it. And the trick is to try and get them talking to each other, take the politics out of it and make it about trade. I mean, I think that's why, Danny, I haven't got a lot of CBI members, crying foul about Brexit anymore, because frankly, they just want to get on with it. They just want to do trade.
Can I ask about talk about this issue of trade? The big controversy at the moment is Australia, and whether or not to and the reason why that's interesting is less the specifics of it, though that's obviously very interesting to people in the farming industry and other food industries. It's the general principle. This is the first time we've hit this issue of a vested interest group against the general interest, I suppose, in cheaper meat. Does the CBI have a dog in that fight? How do you choose between being presumably the representative of some of the people who have that special interest and also being the representative of the generality of businesses who want cheaper imports?
Yeah, look, we are conflicted in that regard, and I'm always public when talking to government about it. There are other areas where because we've got different sectors in membership, when sector interests collide, the CBI is in a difficult position. And so I think what we like to see happen in those situations is there is genuine fact base brought to bear and win-wins whenever you can find them. But yes, just for viewers and listeners who aren't across the story, a would-be trade deal with the Australians would attract in tariff-free a particularly sensitive product for the UK. And when I say the UK, I mean Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales too. Beef, lamb, sugar, and so on. And if they come in and they undercut UK prices, then that's very damaging to the UK farming industry. And yeah, it is a straightforwardly difficult one, right? In a year where we have said the world must end its protectionism, right? We've had a serious protectionism in the world for the last 12 years. And the hope is, as we come up to the G7 in Cornwall, that the world leaders with the Biden administration are much more open, reduce protectionism, increase trade. And here you have a very real trade issue. If you are a UK farmer, the idea of having cheaper imported meat, that really does challenge your business. I think, in fairness to the farmers that we work with, they're not saying, no, under no circumstance can we do a free trade deal. I think they want to try and find mechanisms to ensure that actually this doesn't mean the destruction of the UK farming industry. So I don't know, I wouldn't quite call it a win-win and an easily bridged one, but that, when the government gets going, that will be the deal they have to do. And I suspect it'll look a bit like the Brexit process, where we find mechanisms and procedures to try and resolve conflicts.
Okay, let me move to another big issue that's faced you. You had Brexit. The other big issue is COVID. A massive strain for business. Where do you know? I suppose we've got quite a good test case at the moment. The government isn't sure what to do about the Indian variant. It's a risk judgment, right? And another issue of risk judgment is, should people be able to go on holiday? You've obviously got a lot of members who have a lot of strong interest in people doing that, although obviously you'll have also some people in the staycation industry, so you'll have people in both areas. But is the CBI gung-ho for opening up, or is it saying to government, no, we accept you have to have a constrained approach, you have to take risk judgments, and we accept that that may not be possible to open up? Where does the CBI stand on those things?
Yeah, well, look, we're not gung-ho. Look, the hardest job in the world is the Prime Minister's on all these calls, right? Because he has to weigh up the health evidence, the economic evidence, getting kids back to school, civil liberties, freedoms, safety. So his job is harder than mine. I will and can make advocacy on behalf of business. But most business people I speak to are not gung-ho in the face of the science, right? They're not ordering their employees back to work. They're not demanding reopening to customers in unsafe environments. What they want, though, is two things. One, they want it to be evidence-led. And what we've got with SAGE, which is a brilliant construct, by the way, but we've got a huge concentration of evidence and data targeted at doing everything you can to stop the spread. What we don't have, to the contrary, is a huge body of evidence and data that brings to life the trade-off and the economic realities. And for me, the best example was, I don't know if you remember, but we had the curfew at 10 p.m. of pubs, right? You had to close the pub doors at 10 o'clock because there was science which suggested after 10 o'clock, frankly, everybody gets drunker and therefore they stop social distancing. Anyway, And the hospitality industry fought that and said it's madness and there's no basis for it. But there wasn't really an evidence base that was sort of making the argument. So the burden of proof was upon them. After a few weeks of doing it, it became very clear from the data that it was a stupid thing to have done. And they moved the curfew back from 10 till 11. And I think since then, I think our argument has been, we need to take a data-driven approach to this. And SAGE and the scientists will be prone to overprotection, and they may be right, but let's please gather data and evidence. So for example, now on issues like international travel, where I think the government will head is, let's find ways to make it possible, but mitigate risk. And I think that's where most businesses are. So no, we're not the gung-ho, open everything up by any means, but I think we are. Can we please have an evidence base for this? Because on the whole, businesses are pretty good at mitigating risk, and most transmission happens in houses, not businesses.
Okay, let me ask you about another quite tricky issue, and I've written about it a bit today myself, and that is the whole issue of cancel culture. The whole idea that businesses or organizations, they find it embarrassing in terms of their public position to employ somebody who may have said something outrageous there too quick, then to dismiss them. And I wonder whether the whole issues of how to balance that with the needs for diversity, with the need to protect people from harassment or unsafe environments in which people are offensive to racial minorities or to women, that whole area presumably has become more difficult as people have become more aware of the issues involved. Has it presented a problem or an opportunity or in the CBR, or is it just not coming up really?
Well, I think what is coming up is all businesses are going to have to get pretty smart about this thing called inclusion. That is definitely true, right? So, and when I've seen so just again, for those of you that aren't working in companies and aren't following this agenda, how can you have more diverse people in the workplace? How can they be treated equally? How can they be protected from discrimination and offense? And how can they have equal opportunities to everybody else? Charlie Mayfield, who I mentioned before, former chairman of John Lewis, who was my previous boss, I think he had a lovely way of looking at this, which they adopted at John Lewis, which is to say, rather than having a sort of policing culture and a sort of negative view of diversity, which says if anybody is being uninclusive or non-diverse, they should be punished. What we really need in businesses and institutions is diversity celebration, right? Which is actually, let's be profoundly interested in the diverse backgrounds and celebrate them in our organizations, rather than constantly policing anybody doing harm. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating everybody should be allowed to do harm in celebration of diversity. But I do think that when organizations that do this well, and we're trying it at the CBI, so just, I'll give you an example, right? We had a really good sort of CBI message around Passover, and we had a really good run around Eid. And employees that were celebrating either of the above, they would talk to colleagues about what they did, and it would be profoundly interesting and truly celebratory. So I don't know, maybe that's a little bit happy clappy and I want the world to be a happy place, but maybe it's because I'm a Northern Irish Jew that I know what it is to avoid conflict. But I think that's a more interesting way of looking at this agenda.
Okay, I got 5 minutes. I got two things I want to ask you. The first is a question not posed by me, but posed by somebody who wants to be anonymous, an anonymous attendee, asking about the clash between, I suppose, the responsibilities that business has to, for instance, a cleaner environment or less obesity, and the fact that you also represent the sugar industry, say. How do you manage that?
Yeah. Well, climate, to be honest, is becoming much easier, because I think we've reached a tipping point in the world where actually there's money to be made an advantage to be had from being faster to net zero. That's just the truth now. There aren't many companies who are saying, God, this climate change stuff is really annoying and damages our business. The vast majority of companies are going, how do we outcompete on the race to net zero, right? So if you're supermarkets, you're already in a race to make sure that you've got the greenest possible packaging and the best waste management proposals. If you're banks, you're queuing up to lend money to businesses that are investing in decarbonization technology. So I think the climate one is easier. I think it's moving into classic win-wins. On the other side, and I think the broader point, right, which is, how do I feel about the CBI representing industries that are, controversial? My own view is, if you've signed up to the CBI, it's because you want to be participating in the sort of contract with society. And so most of our members that are in oil or in sugar or whatever it might be, they're usually working on transitioning strategies and sustainability strategies. They are not diehard, capitalists who are disinterested in society. And I'm good with that. It's funny, I actually asked the Archbishop of Canterbury, who I got a wonderful chance to speak to the other month, and I said to him, do you think, because he's a former business person, and I said, do you think businesses should be moral? And he said in a very profound way, which I'll leave you all with, he said, they shouldn't be moral, but they should be virtuous. So even though he's not my rabbi, I think that's a really interesting idea, and it resonates in my head even now.
So, okay, that brings me on to quite nicely segueing into my last question, and that is, if you'll excuse it, because it's an issue that bothers me, but is something that I think about a lot, and that is the responsibilities of being a Jew in public life. And both of us are involved in things to which we weren't appointed because we were Jewish, but to which our Jewishness is not irrelevant. And there are moments where it's hard to remain unengaged, and we've got one of those now. Possibly more in your case because you're leading an organization, whereas I'm much freer to say whatever I think. It must be quite difficult sometimes to decide what is appropriate for you to say, for what is appropriate for you to do in terms of identifying yourself with your ethnic background, and yet I know it's very important to you, and you've been always a valued leader in the Jewish community, so it's not a small thing if you didn't want to engage in those things. So tell me how you manage that.
Well, look, I'm only 6 months in, so I don't know yet. It hasn't really presented itself as a problem, but I think the one thing I would say is it comes back to this, remember my touchy-feely stuff about celebrating diversity. I intend to be proudly Jewish in what I do as part of being proud and interested in lots of different communities. And I think that's the way to deal with it. I just think, I would hate to be somebody that was embarrassed to say on television that I was Jewish, or admit to being Jewish, or admit to, being a fan of, the foundation of Israel. At the same time, I'm not a single issue kind of guy, right? I'm also really interested in British Muslims, and I'm interested in, Geordies, and I'm interested, I'm just interested in a diverse Britain. And I think through that frame, it actually becomes a pretty positive thing to be and to do and to exhibit than something to be nervous about.
Well, Tony, thank you so much. We've reached the end of our period. I think lots of people who know you are very proud that you've got this job, and they'll be prouder still to hear the reflections that you have. I certainly felt that way. It was wonderful to have you. I hope everyone on the call enjoyed it and found it as stimulating as I did. It was really terrific, and it's not a small thing for you to give away your time. I am afraid that I do want Liverpool to draw tonight rather than win, but I want you to enjoy the game.
As if that's enough, Danny. But thank you very much, and thank you to you, and also to David, all the team at 1-to-1. I've really got to know what you do in the last few weeks, and you should be very proud of the contribution you're making, David and team.
I agree. Thank you, everyone, and I'm going to leave you now. Bye-bye.